Okay, guys, welcome back. We are going to launch right into our first primary tissue type, and that is the epithelial tissues. So sometimes we'll say epithelia for the different types. That would be a plural term. Remember that a basic rule of thumb about epithelia is that these tissue types are going to cover or line the body surfaces. Okay? Any surface you want to talk about, if it's an external surface like the skin, if it's an internal surface of my nose or my mouth, or even deep down into the digestive tract, maybe in the inside of my stomach, all going to be surfaces, okay? So before we launch into those surfaces, we need to consider the fact that there are different classes of epithelium that exist within us. And those classes oftentimes are determined by how thick they are, and how thick they are is dependent on the number of layers that we might see. So here we see some basic, a basic definition of simple epithelium would be one row of cells. That's simple, right? If I have one row of cells, I don't care what the cells shapes are. They could be looking like this, that are kind of block-like shapes of these cells, right? Remember, all of the shapes of these cells are because of the microfilaments and stuff we learned a while back. But the key about this class being simple is that it's one row. Now, what am I looking for? The staining of these cells usually lights up the nucleus very well, okay? So the dyes take to these nuclei. We know that the nucleus is a major control center of the cell. So usually what I'm looking for are nuclei to determine where a cell is. Because it's not always obvious. These are nice, perfect images. I can see a nice, clear boundary around these cells. But that's because it's an image, it's a drawing, right? It's going to be picture perfect. But I can see the nuclei in a row. It is simple. Now, on the flip side, you might talk about strata. Think of the layers of Earth that might be revealed maybe on a mountain side or something like that, or along the road. You can see where they blasted to build that road. You'll see layers of rock, strata of rock. Stratified. This would be many layers, okay? So you see here that we got a layer here, we got a layer, we got a layer. And these layers seem to get thinner here in this example, but many layers means stratified. So simple, one layer, stratified, many layers. Occasionally, you will find that body surfaces will have a row of cells, like we see here. One, two. Now this is technically just one row of cells. If you look at the fact that they're attached here at the bottom, another one attached at the bottom, another one attached, they all have an attachment to something underneath, right? But they don't all, this one right here doesn't reach the top, doesn't reach the top. This is where our actual surface is, right? So this, if this is the skin over here, for example, many layers here would be stratified. Then this is just space. This is just the air outside of our skin, okay? And then this down here is whatever is underneath the skin, okay? Whatever it's attached to. So, so these are the surfaces on top. They call it an apical surface up on top, okay? Well, not all of these cells reach the apical surface, right? The apical side of these cells. And usually they call this side the basal side. Think basement, okay? Apex for the top of a mountain. Well, this is the top of the cells, apical. And then down here, we have the basal side. It's on the basement side of that cell. All right, so this, if we look at the nuclei, I see a nucleus, there's one underneath kind of, there's one on top it almost looks like, right? It would be hard, you're hard pressed to tell, is that stratified or is that not stratified? especially if you don't see the boundary of these cells, okay? Here, again, it's picture perfect. I can see where the boundary is. But it almost looks like it's stratified if we consider the fact that that nucleus is over top of this nucleus, kind of, right? So it's a false stratified layer, right? It's falsely looking stratified, pseudostratified. And here they call it a pseudostratified columnar epithelium because a lot of these cells are tall and thin like a column would be, okay? So we've got simple, we have stratified. Those will be the two by far that you're going to run into in our discussions of epithelia. And then you have occasionally these pseudo-stratified situations where really it's one row of cells, but it looks like they are almost stratified. Now, this mention of columnar brings us to the next thing we need to talk about before we launch into the epithelia, and those are the cell shapes, okay? So we're going to have different classes, simple, stratified. We have this one weird one in the middle with pseudostratified, but then we have our cell shapes. Now, cells can look rather block-like you see here, this two-dimensional image. And they're roughly like a cube, okay? Cuboidal. They can be columnar, so more or less, taller than they are wide, like you see up here with a columnar. So we're going to have columnar cells. We're going to have cuboidal cells. And then we also have the possibility of kind of a really flat, spread out cell like this. Now for this, I always think about fried eggs, okay? If you look at a fried egg from the top, right, you look down on your frying pan, well, isn't the fried egg going to look a little more like this one over here, right? It looks rather large, a fried egg, right? Because the white's spread out, in the middle you've got your yolk. Well, the nucleus gives us this thickness just like the yolk does, all right? And it's going to look rather large. But when you look, if you were to slice a fried egg, right, and look at it from the edge, well, it really is quite thin. Squamous is describing that thin layer. If it happens to be a squamous cell, it's going to be a very thin layer of cells. Now, this does not mean that you couldn't have squamous cells piled on top of one another, stratified, okay? Or you may have these very thin cells in a single layer, simple, okay? So what we do is we take these terms and we combine them. We might have simple, and then we follow it up with, let's say, cuboidal. Simple cuboidal epithelium. Tells you, well, it tells you two or three things, right? It tells you that it's one layer, it tells you the shape of the cell, and epithelium, it kind of reinforces the idea that this is a surface somewhere. It's covering a surface. All right, so let's launch into these. What you will need to know, okay? Big hint here. You're going to need to know, be able to identify by sight the 6 epithelial types I'm going to go over here. Some are going to be easy. You won't have to really work hard about it. You see it once, you're going to get it every time after that. Some are a little tougher, okay? I'm going to try to guide you through those. And then you'll need to have basic function and a location. Now, I'm going to give you the easiest, most, kind of distilled down function and locations that I think of when I think of these different tissues. And I'm going to provide you with a study sheet. I have a study sheet that I usually use in lab, but here we're going to do this in lecture, and you can use that study sheet to help you with these tissues, all right? So let's run into the first. Now, some of these are going to catch you by surprise at first, but here we have stratified squamous epithelium. So now you know it's many layers and it's squamous, so they're going to be thin cells. Now let's say that I throw either of these images at you and you have to tell me what the tissue type is, right? I'm not telling you it's stratified squamous. What do you need to look for? Well, if it's an epithelial type, I'm looking for space because I know it's a surface. If I were to, for example, if I were to take a slice through my arm, right? Not a good thought, but if I took a slice through my arm and then you looked at my arm straight on, you would notice in a slice of that arm, you're going to have space outside of that arm because this surface is right up against the air outside of this arm, okay? So what I'm looking for an epithelial type is space, white space. I see white space here. That means this is a surface of something. This right here is where the surface is, okay? For this one up here, I see white space. That purple area here, that purple zone above has a surface, and the purple zone below has a surface. Okay? So if I were to say, okay, this tissue is the same as this tissue, what is it? Okay? What I would hope you do is look for the cells. First, I'd say, okay, this is got to be an epithelial type because I see white space next to this tissue type. And then I'm looking for nuclei. All right, I see nucleus, a nucleus, a nucleus. They're all kind of dark purple here. Nucleus. They're all over the place, are they not? Are they in one layer? I'd say no, right? These are in many layers. I'm going to go for stratified immediately. Now, you're going to find in your list of epithelial types, there's only one stratified tissue I need you to know. So you're kind of home free already if you study this, okay? This is stratified squamous. Some of these are really thin cells. Check out, some of these on the outside that are kind of sloughing off here. These are really thin cells, okay? This happens to be the surface of my esophagus, but I'm not going to ask you to know that kind of detail. One really common place you would find this would be the skin. The skin has many layers like this. Now, this looks somewhat different down below, but you'll come to the same conclusion if you approach this. And I ask you, what is this? Don't give you the name. You look at it and hopefully the first thing you notice is there's white space. This has to be a surface. I already know it's an epithelial type. Now I have to determine where the cells are. So I mark off, I see nuclei, nuclei, nuclei. And some of these, it's really nice, right? I can see even the boundary of these cells where they touch one another. This is clearly many layers of cells. This is stratified, and there's only one stratified type I need you to know, and that's stratified squamous epithelium. This happens to be the inner lining of the vagina, okay? But you see this kind of lining, this stratified squamous, inside your mouth, inside your nose, and just inside the urethra, all these different places, okay? Not just the skin. All right, so what's a major function of stratified squamous? Well, if we think about it, if you have many layers to a wall, many layers to the wall here on the outside surface, it makes sense that this would be protective. It's not going to allow things to just go freely through that wall if it's stacked up many layers thick, okay? And so it makes sense that we would see a stratified squamous where the skin is. And it's on the inside of lots of the body orifices, okay? So again, I choose the vagina as an example. You could choose the rectum, you could choose the mouth, you could choose any of these places. There's going to be protection. Makes sense, right? Because outside of us, we have, it's kind of a danger zone, right? We've got viruses and bacteria and stuff we need to keep out. So a protective stratified squamous. All right. Now, simple squamous epithelium. Remember now that simple means one layer, okay? Now, it would make sense that one layer is not going to be as protective as many layers, right? This is still an epithelium, so it's going to be a surface. So one of the first things I'm looking for with an epithelium, again, is white space. I'm looking for white space. So here's white space. White space. So I know that I have some surfaces here, right? If that's white space, then this is some possibly internal surface if this is a tissue, right? Here's a surface. There's a surface. Surface on this side, right? So it's actually you have surfaces on both sides of these cells. Now, why do I know there's cells there? Well, I look for the nuclei, right? So here's a nucleus. I can see a kind of a dark purple here. That's got to be a nucleus, right? I see another nucleus over here. Kind of hard to see that one. All right, so I see some nuclei here. So these cells are in a row. Some of them are easier to see than others. Here's some nuclei in a row. Kind of have to look really hard, but they're there. All right, and it does not seem like they're piled on top of one another. It seems like these are in one row, simple. And it seems like these are really thin cells too, which means they're fried egg thin cells, right? So here we have lots of different squamous, simple squamous cells. Now, these pockets are actually pockets of air. So where do you think that is? These are all pockets of air in our lungs. Okay, so ignore the black box here. It's down in this area, right? Down in the actual lung tissue that you're going to find the alveoli, these pockets of air, and they are lined with simple squamous. Now, simple squamous means it's not protective. The sole purpose of these very thin types of epithelia would be to allow for certain things to get across. And in this location, it would make sense that we're trying to absorb the respiratory gases from our environment, like oxygen, okay? And in some cases, we're trying to actually get rid of certain gases too, like CO2. So we have a major one here with simple squamous would be absorption, absorbing those gases from our environment. Key locations for simple squamous, one big one, and I always go to this as an example because it's so easy to find the pockets of air where the alveoli are in the lungs. You'll also find this in other places, like in the inner lining of the blood vessels. Again, this makes sense because you're going to have absorption and movement across the membrane, and we want to keep it thin. But the obvious one, usually I go for lungs. So if you see these pockets like this, with the cells lining each pocket like that, then we're usually talking about lungs, and that's a great example of simple squamous. All right, simple columnar. All right, so now again, we can think about what the words mean, right? Simple columnar. Simple meaning one layer, columnar meaning the cells have a certain shape, okay? So I'm going to go over here and let's use some yellow here. I think it'll show up pretty good. So down here I see, I can kind of make out where the nucleus is, and you can kind of envision how this cell and this cell, right? We can kind of shave each cell right off because you can see where the nucleus is. We have the nucleus, nucleus, nucleus. And it looks to me like these nuclei are all in a row. One row. Simple. Okay? I see the same thing here. This is all lining up. This is straight from your textbook, okay? These are all nice lined up cells. It's a little harder to see, that these are actually tall, thin cells, columnar cells. And these are in the inner lining of the intestines. Now, in the intestines, this is where we actually absorb our nutrients. Okay, so it makes sense that you would have a good amount of absorption going on. There's some secretion as well, so there's some things that are put out into that long tube. of the intestines, but a big part of it is absorption. And we see all these little finger-like projections. They're called villi. Don't worry about the villi term right now, but they're these like finger-like projections, and they have the ability to help us to absorb things. So the key identifying locations might be the digestive tract, like the intestines where we absorb things. Another we find in the fallopian tubes, we will actually find columnar epithelia. There it's less about absorption, but usually the key example when it comes to simple columnar would be these linings of the digestive tract, the intestines. Okay. All right, next one. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, so now this is our unique one, right? It's not simple, it's not stratified. It's kind of in between. And we do see a certain shape of columnar from these cells. So if we go over here, this is from your book, so this is making it easier for us, right? I can see here that this particular cell, we'll go to yellow, seems to be kind of long and thin. It doesn't show you where it's attaching to the bottom, but remember this is just a two-dimensional image, just a slice. So it could be either in front of this or behind this slice of tissue that we'd be looking at where it actually attaches. But that looks like long and thin. That looks columnar to me. And here you can see the actual image up above. So this is really the actual image, and this is just a drawn out picture of what we see up here. But it looks almost like these, if we look for the cells, we look for the nuclei. It looks like these nuclei are kind of almost stratified, but the fact is it's all attached at the bottom. We just don't see where they're all attaching. Okay, so this is a unique one, pseudo-stratified. Key place for this is the trachea. Okay, we have a lot of these trachea with cilia that are actually those cell extensions that move. Actually, in this case, that moving mucus always upwards. It's like an escalator for mucus, keeping that mucus out of our respiratory tract. There's a bunch of mucus being produced here, so it's a lot about secretion. So when we see a lot of these epithelia, we see a lot of absorption, and in some places we see some secretion. So absorption, secretion, we're going to see those a lot among our epithelia. Key place for this would be the trachea. Just a hint that I didn't think of mentioning earlier. As you're trying to make sure we have these down, you can make flashcards. You can print out pictures of these from Google Images. You can take the very images from my slides, maybe the handouts of the notes. Just cut out the piece. If you want to do it hands-on, you could do that. Cut it out. On the other side of that flashcard, you want to have the name, the functions, the locations. Okay, I would go with the big ones that I'm providing you, because you're going to go to the book and you might find there's a ton of locations of these things. Just go with the one or two that I give you, and you'll keep it simple. Now you could use this image in Quizlet, right? You don't have to do it in like actual paper index cards. You could do this on Quizlet, put the picture in, and then the identifying information would be the name, function, location. Okay. All right, we're getting there. We have, let's see, we have two more epithelial types to do, okay? Simple cuboidal, okay? Let's get our bearings here. Simple means one layer. Cuboidal means they're going to be cube-like, right? In fact, oid means like or resembling. So cube, resembling, cube-like. It's an epithelium again, so we know it's covering something, some surface somewhere, okay? And these would be really big giveaways. If you see rings of cells, okay, so if I show you this, here we have, and I indicate this ring right here, and I say, what is this tissue type right here? This makes up this ring. Well, again, we can approach it in a similar way as we did before. is there a surface? And the answer is yes. I see a surface right here in the middle. I see white space. All right, so here, right up against this surface, all the way around, it's like the inside of a paper towel roll, okay? If I were to cut a paper towel roll crossways, I would see white space on the inside, and there's a surface on the inside, right? The cardboard on the inside would be that surface. All right, now I've got my simple down, or I've got the fact that it's a surface down, right? Now I ask, okay, is it one or more layers? And I look carefully and I find, oh, there's one nucleus, another one, and they go in a row. Now, a couple of these don't look like they have a nucleus, but these do, right? So this looks like one row of nuclei, therefore simple. Then I ask the next question, which is shape. Now this is a rough shape, remind you. Let's do these over here. So this looks like roughly a cube. It's not really that much taller than it is wide. Okay, this one it's a little harder to see. Here's one that's a little wider, right? These are roughly cube-like cells. So we're going to go with cuboidal, right? Not columnar. They're not tall and thin. They're not flattened out like a squamous cell. These are simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, we see them again down here. It's just a little harder to see, right? These images are not always picture perfect like your books like to show you. But let's pick a good one. Here's a good one. So I'm kind of outlining it in blue. There's a cell, there's a cell, there's a cell, right? And they go all the way around in this ring. So if you see a ring like this of roughly cuboidal cells, it's probably simple cuboidal, and these rings are very common in the kidney, all right? So these actually make up rings in the kidney tissue. These are actually little tubes, just like I was mentioning, like a paper towel roll. These are little tubes. So if you imagine, again, this is a two-dimensional image, right? This is like a tube. If you were to extend this circle to another circle coming towards you out of the screen of your computer, right, and going into the screen, you would find that that's a little tube inside there. And these millions of little tubes are what are helping to filter your blood, okay? So there's a lot of absorption and secretion going on. We absorb things out of these tubes that we don't want to lose as urine, and we secrete things into these tubes that we do want to lose, like waste products, okay? So key locations, kidneys and glands. Makes sense with glands too, doesn't it? Because with glands, we're secreting, like sweat glands, or oil glands on our skin. We're secreting things. Some of them are waste products, but we're getting rid of those things, so we're secreting. We're absorbing, not too much in those cases, but we're secreting for sure. All right, last example of epithelial types. And this is also associated with the urinary system, but in a different way. Okay, here we have a unique one called transitional epithelium. And if we look, again, we're looking for a space, right? So here I see white space. I know that this is, therefore, below here, this has to be a surface. It has to be a surface that's somewhere, right? If it's space next door, then it's got to be a surface. So we know it's an epithelial type. Now we have to kind of look at, is it simple or stratified? That's usually our first thing. So we look for nuclei, okay? So I'm looking and I see nucleus, 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 right? I'm just marking all the nuclei I can find here. And it looks like it could be stratified. And one might fall for this as being stratified squamous epithelium. But even the cells on the outside portions of this epithelium seem rather thick, rather almost round. They almost look like if you were to take a bunch of pebbles and put them on a cooking tray or something, right? If I just pile up a bunch of pebbles from a stream on a cooking tray, or something like that, right? They're just going to kind of pile up on top of one another like this. And these are key hallmarks of transitional epithelium. What will happen? These are found in the ureter and the bladder, okay, where you store your urine. So if the bladder fills up, this is the inside of the bladder, okay? Out here where the spaces are, that's the inside space of your bladder, or the inside space of some of these tubes associated with your urinary tract. And when the bladder fills up, okay, it's going to stretch the walls of that bladder. So imagine this being the wall of that bladder. And what will happen is all of these cells of transitional epithelium will actually kind of spread out. Okay? So where we see stretchy walls like that, like the bladder that can really expand to take on urine and store urine, we find transitional epithelium. Now the fact that we find it so often associated, and pretty much always associated, with the urinary tract causes us to now refer to it, this is recent in your book actually, that they call it urothelium. So it's just a big tip off that, hey, we don't find this in many other places, so we're going to call this urothelium. So transitional epithelium, in some places you look, urothelium, your book is starting to use. All right, so what is a major function here? This particular epithelium isn't so much about absorption or secretion. There's not a lot of movement of items across this wall, but it's more about stretch. It allows for a stretchy component so that urine, for example, can actually be contained and still allow for stretch. Urinary tract would be your key example, including the bladder. Okay, so we got our, I think it was 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, different epithelial types. You're going to want to know to identify them by site. I'll give you some other materials for that. You can also use APR in the histology section for that. In fact, this is where I get some of these tissue images. You want to know a function, and you want to know the locations. Okay. Again, I'll have a study sheet up in the lecture section for the tissues. Give you a way to kind of get started with the tissues. Maybe you can get some flashcards together, something like that. All right. All right. Next time we launch into connective tissues. We're going to actually do connective tissues next.